Good morning, everyone. This is Shylo. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator of Edmonton, based on the Robertson Wesley United Church. Today I have a lot of information. Today's live stream is going to be about queer leaders. I kind of focused it a little bit on Canada. So obviously this is not everyone that has made big changes in Canada within human rights or laws. But these are a few key folks that I'd like to bring to light today. So the first person that I'd like to chat about is Jim Egan. So Jim Egan was born in 1921 in Toronto, and unfortunately died in March 9th of 2000. Here I have a photo of him as well here. So he's the one with the fancy mustache on the right. So he was a Canadian LGBT rights activist, best known for his role in the landmark Supreme Court of Canada case Egan versus Canada. Egan realized he was gay at a very young age and met his lifelong partner, John Nesbitt, who's on the left there, in 1948. Professionally, Egan was self-employed as the owner of a biological specimen business, and so felt able to speak out without risk of losing his job, which was a huge fear that many other LGBTQ people had back then. Beginning in 1949, Egan wrote hundreds of letters and articles, opinions, and editorial pieces to both magazines and newspapers, advocating equal rights for and criticizing inaccurate portrayals of both lesbian and gay people. He also, in 1964, was featured on the Sydney Cat's quoted "The Homosexual Next Door," which was a Maclean's article, which was one of the most positive portrayals of homosexuality ever to appear in mainstream Canadian publications up until that time. Having reached retirement age, Egan actually began trying to collect his Canadian pension plan benefits in 1986. This is where he tried to apply for spousal benefits for his partner, Nesbitt, the following year. Unfortunately, when they applied for it, they decided to apply for it just because they'd make a really strong case for the legal rights of same-sex couples being able to gain pension plan benefits. And so they applied for it, and unfortunately their benefits were denied. And they took the case to court, and they lost again in the federal court in 91, as well as the Federal Court of Appeal in 93, and then until the court reached the Supreme Court in 94. In 95, the Supreme Court ruled, and ruled against Egan, actually, on the issue of spousal benefits. They said that finding that the restriction of such benefits to heterosexual couples was a justified infringement, because the core purpose of benefits at the time was to provide financial support to women who would spend their lives raising children rather than being employed. So unfortunately it did not pass, but because of their coarse claim, it was seen as a significant victory to LGBTQ rights, just because sexual orientation then was prohibited grounds of discrimination underneath the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedoms. So I had a lot of later successes in courts, but unfortunately for Egan, the beneficiaries did not pass. The next gentleman I'd like to chat about is not Egan, but this gentleman, George Gilbert. George was born in 1926 and died in 1996. He was known as the last person in Canada to be arrested, charged, persecuted, convicted, and imprisoned for gross indecency. So this was before the decriminalization of homosexual acts in 1969, sorry. Which was reformed because of Gilbert's case. So Gilbert was originally from Saskatchewan. He was raised in Calgary, Alberta, so close to home here. And in 1960, he was convicted on 18 charges of gross indecency and sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment. Upon his release, he then moved to Northern Canada and the Northwest Territories to work, And then in 1965, he was picked up by the police for questioning and related to an arson that happened nearby. Thankfully, he was found not guilty for that or having any involvement with the fire. But in the case of being apprehended, Gilbert voluntarily admitted that he was having consensual homosexual relations with 4 different adult men. And because of this, he was subsequently arrested and charged again with 4 counts of gross indecency. So a court-ordered psychiatrist assessed Gilbert as incurably homosexual. I don't really know what that's supposed to mean, but I guess at that time it meant that it was a bad thing. And so, yeah, he was considered incurably homosexual, and he was sentenced to preventive detention, which means indefinitely, as a dangerous sexual offender, just because he had consensual sex with an adult man. He was now a dangerous sex offender, according to the law. And Gilbert appealed the Court of Appeal for the Northwest Territories, and then it was dismissed, so he brought it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And again, his appeal was dismissed in 1967, and the decision was 3-2. The day after Gilbert's conviction was upheld, the New Democrat Party, Tommy Douglas, who is amazing, invoked Gilbert's name in the House of Commons of Canada, stating that homosexuality is a social and psychiatric problem rather than a criminal one, which, I mean, I also would disagree with the psychiatric problem side of it, but definitely not a criminal one. And he asked the Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, if he would consider setting up a commission to study the issues. Douglas later followed up with the Minister of Justice at the time, which was Pierre Trudeau, and asked if there was any consideration to remove this or to change it. And within 6 weeks, Pierre Trudeau presented the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which was happening between 1968 and 1969, which was a bill that was then passed that would decriminalize the homosexual acts between consenting adults. So this law thankfully passed in 1969. Unfortunately, Gilbert still remained in prison until 1971. And then he was released and had a few years left until he did pass later on. So that's a little bit about George Gilbert. The next gentleman I want to talk about is Rupert Raj. So Rupert Raj here was born in 1952. He was born in Ottawa, Ontario. Raj was a Canadian of Indian and Polish descent, and he was a well-known trans activist and considered himself as a transgender man. He's worked a lot since his own gender transition in 1971. And he's been recognized a few times with several different awards, such as his inclusion in the Natural Portrait Collection of the Archives, or Archives. It's Archives with a Q, so it's a little queer innuendo there, which is the Canada's LGBTQ2+ archives. At the age of 19, he scheduled his own appointment with an endocrinologist and was admitted his first shot of testosterone. He then later graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, and was involved in many different associations. One of the first ones was the Association of Canadian Transsexuals, or it was called ACT, A-C-T, and this was based in Toronto. Raj also continued his activism by starting a petition to get Ontario to cover, sex reassignment surgeries, or gender confirmation surgeries, which is what they're called now, through the provincial health insurance plan. And unfortunately, that was very unsuccessful at the time. And later on, in 1978, he decided to start an organization for trans people, including trans men and women, as well as cross-dressers. This was called the Foundation of the Advancement of Canadian Transsexuals, or FACT, F-A-C-T. And the organization's letter, the organization's newsletter was a gender review called A Factual Journal. And in 1981, Raj decided to focus on the unique specific needs of trans men, which at the time there was very few advocacy groups just for trans men in particular, just because one, there wasn't many trans men, and as well as just with male privilege within the trans masculine community. A lot of them were able to pass and live stealth, and so there was not really a need for it, but he decided to do one, and I'm glad he did, because there is definitely some needs that the trans masculine community also needs as well. One of the next people is actually very close to home, so many of you probably already know her, or are aware of her presence. So this is Marnie Panis. So Marnie was born in Camrose, Alberta, and she currently resides here in Edmonton. She is a Canadian LGBTQ activist and identifies as a transgender woman. And she's campaigned all over Canada for LGBTQ causes. She's right now is the diversity and inclusion professional, and she's dedicated to creating safe and welcoming and inclusive environments, especially for the LGBTQ2S+ population at large. And she does this through educating through public and private organizations, different types of levels of government and departments, as well as healthcare, educational institutions, corrections, and law enforcement. Most recently, she was a member of the LGBTQ Apology Advisory Council, which helped draft the apology that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau delivered in the House of Commons on November 28th, 2017. So that was just about almost 3 years ago. Which was an apology towards the LGBTQ2S+ people in Canada for the discrimination and injustices faced by this community as a result of federal legislation, policies, and programs that were in place. She was also part of the work that led to the gender identity and gender expression being added to the protected grounds of discrimination. Also in the Alberta Human Rights Act, she was part of the expert panel that assisted in developing some of the guidelines to support school boards and in Alberta to create policies that created a lot of safe and welcoming environments for students, families, staff, and everyone involved. And lastly, she recently provided a testimony to the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Here she was doing this for support of Bill C-16, which many of you probably are familiar with as this was really recent, which is Bill C-16 is the act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code of Canada to include gender expression and gender identity. And this happened in 2017. So she's very common around the city. She's a great advocate. I've met her many times, and she's just very lovely. So I hope at some point you all get a chance to say hi and meet with her. One of the next groups of people, I'm going to say groups because there's two. There's two folks here that many of you probably know if you listen to the radio. These two are probably one of my favorite bands. They're called Tegan and Sara. Many of you probably are familiar with them. They're all over the radio. They're very popular in the pop genre. They were both born in 1980 in Calgary, Alberta, again also close to home. Tegan and Sara Quinn are identical twin sisters who formed a Canadian indie pop band back in 1998. Both of them are musicians, songwriters, and can use a multitude of different types of instruments. They both live in Vancouver, BC, and are openly out as gay. Tegan and Sara are actively politically and socially engaged. They are both advocates for LGBTQ equality, as well as music education, literacy, and cancer research. In 2012, they appeared on the cover of Under the Radar magazine's protest issue. They were both photographed holding a sign that read, quote, "The rights of the minority should never be subject to the whim of the majority," end quote. Also in Canada, they were actively supporting the Quebec students in their protest against the provincial government. In November 10th, 2016, rather than boycotting North Carolina for their HB2 bill, which is the House Bill 2, If many of you remember from back in 2016, this was the bathroom bills that North Carolina was doing, where they were trying to get folks to only enter bathrooms that had their sex assigned as birth. So for me, example, I was assigned female at birth, so if I were in North Carolina, the bill would have forced me to only enter in female washrooms because of my birth certificate. So that was a huge craze back in 2016, and so Tegan and Sara actually, instead of boycotting their concert in North Carolina, they decided to perform anyway at the Orange Peel and decided to donate all of their proceeds from that show to the Equality North Carolina, which was an organization there that was able to fight the legislation and not let it pass. They were also awarded the Outstanding Music Award at the GLAAD Media Awards, which is awesome because they were beating out high-profile musicians such as Lady Gaga and Elton John, which I think is just amazing. They're both amazing people. In 2014, Tegan and Sara joined the World Pride to perform in the closing ceremonies in downtown Toronto, as well as in 2016, in the wake of the United States' presidential election with Trump, they actually founded the Tegan and Sara Foundation. And this foundation helps to fight for the economic justice, the health, and representation for LGBTQ girls and women. And so they've just been doing a lot of great stuff over the past few years. As a relatively smaller indie band, they are quite popular. Unfortunately, they're not as popular as some would like, especially for me. I love Tegan and Sara. I love all of their songs. I wish they had a lot more representation and were able to get out there. But I think based off of the fame and fortune that they do have, they've been putting a lot of it to good use to help support LGBTQ folks, especially women and girls. Especially with Tegan and Sara both being lesbians. I know if you haven't listened to Tegan and Sara, this is my notion to you, is just please take time out of your day-to-day, go on one of their albums and just take a listen. Their music is fantastic. If you don't know what song to listen to the song Boyfriend. The reason why I like the song is that it brings me back to when I was out as a lesbian. There's a lot of culture within the queer community, and so if you're in different parts of the queer community, there's almost like a whole culture around it. So when I identified as a lesbian, I was part of the lesbian culture, and now I'm part of the trans masculine culture. But within the lesbian culture, there's always this, I guess, theme that goes around where gay women, unfortunately, always seem to fall for a straight woman. And so the song Boyfriend is essentially considered the I Fell for a Straight Girl anthem, and it speaks to me on a spiritual level. As a past lesbian, if you identify as lesbian and you're listening to them, I'm sure you're going to really understand a lot of what they're trying to say, and some of their music just speaks to me, and maybe to you in ways that other songs just couldn't back in that time. So definitely take a look at Tegan and Sara. They're amazing and great. And if you don't like their music, maybe try taking a look at Vivek Sharia's music. So Sharia was born in 81, and she was actually born in Edmonton, Alberta, which is a lot more closer to home. She was born as a Canadian, and she's considered a Canadian musician, a writer, and visual artist. She's currently living in Calgary, where she's the assistant professor in the creative writing program at the University of Calgary. Saraya is also the director on the board of the Tegan and Sara Foundation because they are in close contact with each other, which I think is just fantastic. And the last time I saw Tegan and Sara in concert, Vivek actually opened for them, which is probably why she's been part of their foundation. Vivek has also released over a dozen solo albums in a range of different genres. She's also published many books, such as one called God Loves Hair, which is an illustrated collection of 21 linked short stories about brown, genderqueer child growing up in an immigrant family in Alberta. And also a book called The Boy and the Bindi, which is one of my favorite books, which explores the difference and self-acceptance of gender expectations and gender identities within families. So definitely take a look at some of Vivek's stuff, some of her music, some of her books, and visual art. She's just a fantastic artist all around, and just a lovely person as well. The second last person I have for you today is Aaron McLeod. Aaron McLeod was, I guess still is, a huge influence in my life. I looked up to Aaron all my life, essentially. She was born in 1983. She was also born close to home. She was born actually up in St. Albert, which is not too far from here. She is a Canadian soccer player who plays as a goalkeeper for the NWSL club called Orlando Pride. And she's represented Canada internationally. She's played for the Canadian women's FIFA team, and she's been on the Canadian women's national soccer team since 2002. She's made over 118 appearances for the team. And then she in 2012 was part of the Canadian Soccer Association Centennial Celebration and was honored on the all-time Canadian women's team. I really looked up to her because, one, I played soccer as a young woman. I was also a young gay woman, and McLeod is an openly gay woman, and she came out publicly during a CBC interview following the controversy surrounding the 2014 Sochi Olympics and Russians' gay propaganda laws. She was among a group of athletes who called for a change in the language of the Olympic Charter, where host city contracts must include non-discrimination of sexual orientation. She also served as a Canadian Athlete Commission as the LGBTQ representative. So I guess for me, just as a young queer woman who was a goalkeeper in soccer, she was essentially the person I wanted to be when I grew up. She was essentially everything I was. She was a goalkeeper, soccer, gay, amazing, a great athlete, and was an awesome advocate for gay women in sports. So she's awesome and amazing, and lives really close. So this is a photo of her here. Yeah, amazing shots. The next person, and the last person that I have to show for you guys today is Darren Reid. Unfortunately, Darren also is really close to home for me. As many of you know, I graduated from the King's University, which is why Darren Reid is so unfortunately famous. So Darren was born in 1966. He is a Canadian who was at the center of a landmark provincial and federal legal case. This was labeled the Reid versus Alberta case, which concerned the inclusion of sexual orientation as a protected human right in Canada. Reid's parents were members of the local Christian Reformed Church, and he attended private Christian elementary schools and secondary schools, and eventually enrolled at the King's College, which is now now known as the King's University here in Edmonton. He later transferred to the Calvin College in Michigan, and he earned his physics and mathematical degree, and then returned back to the King's College to work as a laboratory coordinator and chemistry lab instructor. He worked at the King's College at the time for about 3 years, and in 1991, Reid was open with his congregation about being in a same-sex relationship, which unfortunately led to his firing because his sexual orientation was deemed incompatible with the newly created statement of religious belief that was adopted by the King's College. Reid attempted to file a discrimination complaint with the Human Rights, with the discrimination complaint with the Alberta Human Rights Commission, but he was refused on the grounds that sexual orientation was not protected under the provincial's Human Rights Code. So he actually sued the Alberta government and its Human Rights Commission. So because of this, in 1994, Alberta ruled that sexual orientation must be treated as a protected class under human rights legislation, and that the provincial government appealed, and in 1996, the decision was overruled by the Alberta Court of Appeal. This is when the decision was then appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and that's why it's known now as the Reid versus Alberta case, who finally in 1998 said that the provincial governments could no longer exclude protections of individuals from human rights legislation based just solely on sexual orientation. Based on popular misunderstanding, the Reid case was actually not against the King's College at the time, now known as the university. He did not sue King's at all. King's had nothing to do with it. The only thing that they did was fire Reid. And because of that firing, that's when he applied to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and then he sued Alberta, not the school. Yeah, and so the Supreme Court decision in the Reid versus Alberta case has now been used by provincial cases all over Canada, and has helped against any bans of same-sex marriage, or any bans of not having sexual orientation on any of the human rights commissions all over the country. And that's all thanks to Darren Reid for suing Alberta, because the university that I went to decided to fire him. So Reid's very close to home. When I was at King's, I actually did the King's first Pride Week, and it happened to be the exact 20-year anniversary of the Darren Reid case. So that was a really historical moment, and I am lucky to say that the King's University has made a huge progression in where they were back in 91, and now to when I graduated in 2019. They've made huge changes, and I'm really blessed to have been able to go to King's and have a better experience than Reid did as a staff. So yeah, so that's all of the folks that I had today. I'll just go through again, just showing the photos, the names of folks, just so that you guys can see it one more time. So here we have Jim Egan, who again helped with the Egan versus Canada with the benefits for partners. We had George Clipper, who was the last person to be arrested in Canada for homosexual acts that was decriminalized in 96 or 69. We now also touched base on Rupert Raj, who was one of the first important transmasculine advocates who helped organizations for transgender folks such as ACT and FACT, and created safe spaces for transmasculine folks. There was also Marnie, who we talked about, who is an Edmonton-based advocate who's helped all over Canada with a lot of the federal cases, as well as changes to human rights acts. She's also an educator for all the levels of government, education, healthcare, and law enforcement here in Alberta. We also touched base a little bit on Tegan and Sara, who's really great artists and musicians, who I really love listening to, both from Calgary, Alberta, and has done so many things with their fame and wealth to shed information and education around LGBTQ folks, and helped provide foundations for LGBTQ women and girls. And their partner in crime, Vivek Shura, who's part of their foundation. She's also a musician, writer, and visual artist who was born in Edmonton, now lives in Calgary, and she's a wonderful person to get to know. We also talked a little bit about Erin McLeod, who is one of the most important female Canadian soccer players, who is out as lesbian and helped change ways for queer women in sports. And lastly, we touched base on Darren Reid, who made a huge impact on gay people all over Canada, making it illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation, which I think is just fantastic. So all of these people are very important to me and are huge leaders in Canada and in Alberta and in Edmonton and surrounding areas. So all of these people deserve the recognition of the impact that they've had, not only for themselves and the people around them, but for generations to follow, including me, who have been able to live a great life of having, you know, my protections be safe and to live in a safe place and not to worry about not having any supports legally or supports in healthcare, and just being able to be myself. It's all thanks to all of these people, and so I'm internally grateful for the work that they've done, and I'm excited to see who else we can add to the list from now until the next 10 or 20 years. I'd love to see how far we come and how far we can go with making everything in the world equal and better for everyone. So thanks so much for joining me today. If you have any questions or information or want any more info on any of these 8 folks, please feel free to email me or send me a message, and I would love to chat a little bit more. Hello, Melissa. Welcome for joining in. I'm glad that you were able to tune in. But yeah, anyway, have a good rest of your Monday. I will see you all next Monday for the Affirming Reflections live stream at noon. If you are interested, I do have a Affirming Coffee Hour that happens every Thursday at 11 a.m. It goes from 11 till noon. It is a safe drop-in time through Zoom, where you bring your own coffee and we just chat about life, LGBTQ topics, answer questions, hang out. Feel free to join us right at 11 or drop in at any time later on, or come for a little bit and leave. It's totally open, and it's a safe place to come and ask questions and listen and be part of a small talk group and community. So I'd love to see you there. Just send me an email or a message on Facebook for the Zoom link for that. And we'll see you then. So see you Thursday. If not, we'll see you next week on Friday. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good week.